The idea begins on Earth and the dividing line of two major civilizations, India and China. It was about 500 years before Christ. A young Indian prince, Gautama Shakyamuni, was deeply disturbed by the bondage of human existence. Birth, age, illness, and death. Despite the glory and pleasures of royalty, he answered an inner call to sever worldly attachments and undergo extreme trials until he became Buddha, the enlightened one. Buddha saw life as a stream of countless individuals going through endless rebirth, every life the result of former lives, and every fate the effect of former good or evil deeds. Within the cycle of rebirth, suffering is inevitable. To attain liberation is to break away from this cycle and enter into nirvana, an inscrutable state of absolute transcendence. How can one reach this state? Buddha's answer, in its simplest form, was moral conduct, deep contemplation, and intuitive wisdom. Buddha's teaching has been compared to rafts crossing the sea of suffering to reach the shores of nirvana. There are two main schools in Buddhism. The one stressing personal liberation is called Theravada, or more popularly Hinayana, the lesser vehicle. And the one stressing universal liberation is called Mahayana, the greater vehicle. During the 3rd century BC, with the expanding power of the Indian king Ashoka, Buddhism burst out of the Ganges Valley and spread in all directions. In the northwest, it took root in Gandhara and Kashmir. From there, by the beginning of the Christian era, it was moving through Central Asian international highways to China. The Chinese dynasty then was Han, a power in the east that matched Rome in the west. Han influence dominated East Asia from Korea to Chinese Turkestan, from the Gobi Desert to Vietnam. The national creed was Confucianism, a benevolent ruler under the mandate of heaven whose will coincides with that of the people. An orderly society with a rigid family structure. A moral code based on humanity and the practice of perfect virtue for its own sake. The cosmic view was Taoism. Tao, or the way of nature, governs all life, manifesting itself in yin and yang, the negative and positive forces that shape all things. A philosophy of passivity, with avoidance of worldly strife and of a return to purity for the attainment of eternal life. Into this self-contained and smug world came trickles of a foreign idea. The White Horse Temple, reputedly the first Chinese Buddhist monastery, was founded on the legend that Buddha appeared as a golden deity in the dream of Emperor Ming. The earliest historical mention of a Chinese Buddhist community occurred in 65 AD. By the middle of the 2nd century, Buddha was worshipped in the palace along with Taoist deities. But not until the period after the collapse of the Han Empire did Buddhism gain real momentum in China. In the north, under the invading Turkic and Tibetan tribes, incessant warfare, chaos, and misery provided a climate ripe for a religion affording physical and spiritual refuge to the masses. By entering monkhood, common people escaped military and labor services as well as taxation. Non-Chinese rulers, unshackled by Confucian and Taoist traditions, embraced this non-Chinese faith to ensure their victory and prosperity. They listened to advice from monks, who exercised a restraining influence over wanton killing through the preaching of compassion, thus endearing themselves to the downtrodden Chinese. In the south, where the Chinese court found haven, uncertainty and frustration favored the growth of metaphysical speculation. Neo-Taoists considered inactivity as virtue and non-being as the origin of all things. The sage must identify himself with non-being, which is oblivious of self and others, life and death, right and wrong, to mirror the basic Buddhist ideal of emptiness. Thus, a sympathetic dialogue developed between the learned monks and the literati, whose influence enabled Buddhism to gain converts among royalty and the rich. In the chaos of 4th century China, the philosophical foundation of Chinese Buddhism was laid by a few eminent monks such as Dao An, who merged two main currents of Buddhist thought, the practice of meditation and the doctrine of emptiness. His disciple, Hui Yuan, likened the indestructibility of the spirit to the endless transmission of fire from wood to wood, and argued at court that monks be exempt from bowing to the emperor. Another eminent monk, Dao Sheng, propagated the fundamental Mahayana tenet that all sentient beings possess the Buddha nature and are capable of becoming Buddha. He pioneered in the belief of sudden and complete enlightenment after a long process of religious training. And Buddhism began to change the Chinese landscape. The strategic point for transmitting Buddhism into China was Dunhuang, where the northern and southern overland routes met. As early as the middle of the 4th century, cave temples were carved out of the hills to serve traveling monks and native believers. Eventually, this became a center of devotion for the next 1,000 years, and a depository of Buddhist art to this day. Through Dunhuang, two great events occurred at the turn of the century. In 399, Fa Xian, the first Chinese monk to complete his pilgrimage to India, started his journey. In 401, from Kucha, the high monk Kumarajiva traveled to the capital Chang'an to begin his monumental project of rendering into Chinese some of the most important Mahayana scriptures. The Chinese traveler survived untold hardships to reach sacred sites along the Ganges and study holy teachings at the source. Later, he sailed to Ceylon for a short stay. Then, after 200 days at sea, he returned home in 414. By that time, the north had been unified by a Turkic tribe whose emperors identified themselves with Buddhas. The founder of this Northern Wei dynasty encouraged the erection of images and temples and invited a monk to be imperial advisor. However, a Chinese Taoist and a Confucian minister convinced the third Northern Wei emperor that Buddhism was a fictitious foreign religion. Thus, the first of three great persecutions of Buddhism in Chinese history began. 446, a drastic edict was issued to destroy all stupas, paintings, and sutras, and to execute all monks. Restoration came swiftly after the ruler died 8 years later. The succeeding emperor considered himself the reincarnation of Buddha and appointed Tan Yao the chief of monks in 460. As a symbol of the permanence of Buddhism, he created the cave temples of Yunkang. In the first group of caves appeared 5 gigantic Buddha figures representing the past emperors. Admiration for Chinese culture motivated the 6th Northern Wei emperor to move his capital to Luoyang. Temple construction in the new capital mushroomed until 1/3 of the dwelling area in the city was occupied by monks. To rival the glory of Yunkang, cave temples were created at nearby Lungmen. In a cave sponsored by the imperial family, we can still see the magnificence of the processions of emperors and empresses paying respect to the Buddha. Meanwhile, the south produced its Buddhist monarch, Emperor Wu of the Liang dynasty, whose hair was shaved to symbolize devotion. He constructed numerous temples, gave up wine and meat, and prohibited the use of living things in medicine and sacrifice. He convened assemblies to elucidate sutras, with audiences as great as 50,000, including envoys from Persia, Khotan, and Korea. Back in the north, another Emperor Wu, but of the northern Zhou dynasty, had a different vision. Aiming to restore the glory of ancient China, he favored Confucianism and charged Buddhism with fostering disloyalty toward the country and breaking down filial piety at home. The waste of wealth in temple construction and the harboring of undesirable elements in the monastic community were added reasons for the second great persecution of 574. Before Emperor Wu died 4 years later, tens of thousands of temples were appropriated by the imperial family and the aristocracy, and probably more than 1 million monks and nuns were defrocked. The storm was brief. The founding by Emperor Wan of the new Sui dynasty in 581 ushered in the golden